Hitachi Energy is proud to partner with the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Powering Purpose is a new book resulting from the partnership between Hitachi Energy and Monocle. It tells the story of the people and the technology leading the energy transition and ushering in a sustainable and secure future. Hitachi Energy and Monocle work together to provide inspiration on powering people's lives and where to find the energy for change in the era of electrification. Secure your copy now at monocle.com or in store in Monocle outlets around the world. And if you want to understand the role you can play in harnessing connections to ensure a brighter, more sustainable and secure future, head to hitachienergy.com. Hitachi Energy and Monocle, inspiring the energy for change.
Young people protesting is not, in itself, news. Demographic analysis of pretty much any demonstration anywhere will reveal a disproportionately youthful cohort, and this is unsurprising, as such commotions provide many things of which young people are fond: noise, excitement, drama, the sense of generally sticking it to the man, and other young people. But a recent global wave of protests by young people are interesting, have already been extremely newsworthy. In the last few years, they have helped topple governments in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal and Madagascar. They have marshalled in large and influential numbers in Morocco, Kenya, Peru, the Philippines, Serbia, Timor-Leste and Indonesia, among other jurisdictions. They have taken considerable, indeed horrendous risks. In Nepal, at least 72 people were killed and hundreds injured. In Bangladesh, estimates of the dead ran into the hundreds, other casualties into the thousands. And it may be just the beginning of something. These revolts have become known as the Gen Z protests, associated with that generation born roughly between the late 1990s and early 2010s. They are the first human beings who have grown up entirely in the modern online realm, for whom there is no real novelty in being able to communicate with and broadcast to the entire world with a device in their pocket. They are natural-born citizens of the digital world. Most of the governments they have gone up against are not, and it shows. Why has Gen Z chosen this moment? What do these protests in such different places have in common? And if they've been clear what they're against, what are they for? This is the Foreign Desk.
What we wanted as a movement is a dialogue that corresponds and that respects our intelligence and needs.
One of the differences with this is that they have been able to topple government and they've burnt buildings down, they've burnt parliaments down.
More and more, this is about communicating directly, communicating online, and the media, as we would think of it, doesn't really enter their thoughts.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Morocco's protests did prompt reforms. At the urging of King Mohammed VI, Morocco's government announced substantial new investments in education and health. But initial official responses were heavy-handed. At least 3 protesters were killed, many injured, hundreds arrested and imprisoned. Well, I'm joined first of all by Iman Zubai, a Moroccan visual artist who attended the protests in Fez. Iman, first of all, why did you personally think it was important to go along and join in?
I think it is important to join because I felt concerned on many levels. And this is like a general feeling that is not just linked to the Gen Z generation. We don't feel that we live in dignity. I lost lots of family members in hospitals because the healthcare was very poor. And I remember on the ground with other young fellows, we were discussing, and all of us had stories how they either lost parents or family members in very poor condition in healthcare. And if your parents don't have money to take you to private schools, the really public educational system is very, it's not the best. The general politics in Morocco are very much oriented to privatization, and we are not benefiting of any system and the horizon in front of us, it's getting like really tight and narrow.
Which city was the protest you attended, and what was the atmosphere like?
Oh, that's actually a good question. Thank you for this one, because it's not the same atmosphere from a city to another. And the city where I come from, I just want to emphasize the context. It's a city that has been punished for protest since 91. And when I say punished, it's somehow this policy that is in Morocco, because if a city or like a community or a group commits a sort of riot or creates big chaos, the whole city will be punished up to like 20 years, getting no development in the infrastructure, there will be no security, and there is the fear that was there. So the first day nobody came, or I think the police was there. And like when I say the whole place was filled with police, so like even if you want to start protests, they are there, you cannot gather. The second day we were like 15 to 20 person, and it was magical because also it was filled with the police, and each of them just tried to talk to us while walking, and they just separated the whole group. And it was also quite provocating and brutal. I remember the way these men in the authorities talked to me, like pushing me and mocking me, like, don't you have something better to do? Are you just looking for attention? You know, like really making this very personal and insulting. So they make you feel really bad and humiliated. So via Discord, where we were organizing, we had to create our own group from our own city, and where we all shared these experiences.
When you were with your friends at these marches, was there much talk amongst you about similar demonstrations elsewhere in the world? Were people using the demonstrations in places like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal as a reference point?
Well, nothing that I can recall, to be honest. We were like really just trying to keep each other safe, I would say. We'd really just holding hands to each other and trying it. I mean, the fear of the police or to being taken. But like, there is something that we were saying, because we were sometimes like, you know, journalism, they would come or like somebody film it. And we're like, say, we're young people and like we risk that we get identified, but we want to look pretty on the pictures.
I mean, just when you think back on it now, I mean, the Moroccan government, certainly at the urging of King Mohammed, did announce some reforms. Do you feel like these protests did make a difference?
Well, yes, but there is no immediate known response to that. I think what we wanted as a movement is a dialogue that corresponds and that respects our intelligence and needs and potential. And the changes are, of course, they are respectable and they are opening doors to a lot of things in the future. There is no immediate, you know, changes that the government and anything it's not something that we will grasp in the moment. But the thing that I would say was positive and impressive to me too is that even in the TV, they like dedicated 1 hour, 2 hours a day to host youngsters and discuss with them politics. And I think this is what we needed. We needed a political discourse. We needed to talk about politics and to raise this awareness that we know what is happening. And we really need to know how all these things can go together. And we really, really need a serious strategy for future of Morocco. And this is something that I feel that the government, as individuals, as also politicians, they don't have, and they don't feel it the same way that young people do. It is, what are we becoming?
Iman Zubai, thank you very much for joining us. This is the Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio, and joining us now from Kathmandu is Guna Rajluitel, Editor-in-Chief of Nagarik National Daily. First of all, did it strike you at any particular point as a newspaper editor that the protests in Nepal were going to become more than just another protest, that they were in fact going to become a very, very big story?
We have always warned our government to think about this kind of protest. So for us, it was not a surprise thing because people in Nepal, they were anticipating this kind of situation that could happen anytime. Even after the protest in Sri Lanka and the protest in Bangladesh, in that sense, we never thought there would be this kind of response from the public. But once there was brutal killing of these Gen Z people on the first day, the 8th of September, we have realized that is going to be disastrous.
I mean, did you have any sense of why the protesters were attacking media as well as institutions related to the government?
No, I think people were frustrated with all the government institutions, even the delivery of the government. And we were absolute monarchy until 1990s. We got democracy after that. Again, there was a bit interruption in 2005. And now again, we restored democracy in the country. And the people, they had the hope for the changes, but they haven't found any kind of changes. They could not see the fulfillment of their aspirations. I think because of that, people were always frustrated, and our people, they have to go abroad for the earning. Even within the country, they don't have much more industries, and more than that, the service delivery of the government, that is not up to the mark. And there are always stories about the corruptions in the public institutions. I think these are the factors they have been fueling protest in Nepal.
When this protest was happening, did it feel to you at the time like it was connected, that this was Nepal's part of a global phenomenon?
Yeah, I think the triggering factors, they are different, but the protest, that's common because the people around the world, they are interlinked, they are connected. The information consumption pattern is the same. I think that's been helping people to understand things. If we see our generation of the people, they are grown up with the radio. We just listen radio, but we didn't have much more to get informations, and we didn't have other means of communications. But now people have so many ways to gather informations and consume it. And I think that enables people to understand things, what is happening around them, and people relate things. Like if something happens in Sri Lanka, if people are protesting in Bangladesh, their issues are different, but they have the commonalities in the protest. In Nepal, the triggering factor was the social media ban, but people connected dots for these kind of protests.
That was Guna Rajluitel, Editor-in-Chief of Nagarik National Daily in Nepal. This is The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. For a wider look at the Gen Z protests, I'm joined now by Sally Gimson, editor at Index on Censorship. Her team is currently working on an issue of the magazine covering the global Gen Z protests. Sally, if we look at the countries that you're focusing on, Nepal, Morocco, Madagascar, they're obviously three extremely different countries, and they're not the only ones, as we've been discussing, which have had some variation of this phenomenon in recent months or years. So despite that disparity, did you get a sense that there were actually unifying themes to these protests beyond the relative youth of those involved?
Yes, very much so. I mean, they've each been inspired by each other. So, for instance, the ones in Nepal were inspired by the demonstrations in Indonesia, and in turn, were part of the demonstrations in the Philippines that happened after that. It was Gen Z demonstrators who were seeing other people on the streets in other countries, but they were each sparked by something different. So in Nepal, it was the young people hating the corruption in Nepal, and particularly when social media was cut off. In Madagascar, it was about the frequent power and water outages, and it was in Morocco because it was 8 pregnant women died in a maternity hospital in Agadir. But because they all saw the pictures and memes of what was happening elsewhere, they thought, if they can do it, so can we. But at the heart of them all, I think there is this idea that young people don't have a voice in any of these countries. They feel that they're ruled by corrupt political classes where voting doesn't change anything. And they say they feel hopeless, they're worried about getting a job, and feel the system stacked against them. And in fact, social media played another role, not only in organising the demonstrations, but also in seeing pictures of the rich in their country having a great time. So the Nipo babes in Nepal was really important. So they saw pictures of the elites of Nepal with there's a picture of a boy with lots and lots of presents around him, for instance, which was circulated widely on social media. So there was this idea that the elites were doing really well and the rest of the country wasn't.
I mean, does it strike you, though, that in terms of the concerns rather than the methods, that there is anything especially new and distinctive about these protests? Because the thing you were saying about young people feeling like they lack opportunities, no one listens to them, the system's stacked against them, that is not to suggest that there aren't legitimate grounds for complaint on that front, but you could have got pretty much the same speech from somebody standing on a barricade outside the Sorbonne in 1968.
So I think they are quite similar to 68, but there are means to communicate now, which they couldn't, so they can organise bigger demonstrations more quickly. The other thing is that they've been successful in overthrowing the government. In Bangladesh, for instance, Sheikh Hasina left the country in a sort of plane, having killed about 1,000 people, but she left, and they now have a caretaker government there. As a result. In Nepal, the leader also stepped down in Nepal, and they actually voted for a new leader, a new interim leader via Discord, via social media. So I think one of the differences with this is that they have been able to topple governments, and they've burnt buildings down, they've burnt parliaments down. And that didn't happen in 68.
It's pretty clear and this is often the case with demonstrations, it is pretty clear what they're against, and they probably have good reason for being against a lot of those things. But is there any unifying themes, or are there any unifying themes about what they're actually for, what they would like to see replace whatever it is they have?
Well, that's the problem that in all these countries. So they're having a revolt. They've been very successful in many cases in actually getting rid of the leaders of their country, but they don't necessarily know what they want to replace it with. So they don't feel even bizarrely particularly political. There doesn't seem to be an ideology behind them. As you say, they're just unhappy with the status quo. For instance, the student leaders in Madagascar were trying to organise almost after the fact, and then the military took over. So that means that they may well not get a voice in their country. In Bangladesh, there's an interim leader, Mohammed Yunus, but they're going to have elections next year, and it looks like the Bangladesh National Party, the BNP, is going to take over. And again, that's a sort of traditional party. The young people have been unable to come up with their own party. And in Nepal, where they did elect a leader via social media, there's now terrible fallings out between all of them about the current elections and who they're going to back. One of the gripes was that it was the old political classes, that however much you voted, you didn't actually change anything, because Nepal's a relatively free, or has been relatively free in terms of elections, but they're the same old politicians that always get elected. But when Gen Z were asked for a new kind of politician, one of the proposed candidates was a climate change activist, and they were rejected. And her rejection was accompanied by a lot of misogyny and claims that she was from a minority and wasn't a real Nepali. So it's been really difficult for the Gen Z to get together and decide what they actually want.
And just finally, did you glean any insights about what effect significant recent events may have had on the psyche of this generation? Because one thing that they do have in common is that they would have had 2 or 3 years of their teens to early 20s blown out by the COVID-19 pandemic.
I think that's true. I think governments promised that they would build back after COVID, and in many of these countries didn't. And I also think these young people were at home. They were gaming, they were playing on social media, they spent an awful lot of time on the internet. And so they met other people and were able to exchange their gripes. I also think they feel quite despairing, but as I said, they don't have an ideology. I mean, I think they could look at places like the Milk Tea Alliance, for instance, which was in the early 20s, most of it in Thailand and in Hong Kong, sort of before at about the same time as COVID. And they've come up with much more democratic ideas of the kind of countries they want to be, partly because they're opposed to China and what's going on in China, because they're in that part of the world. But they all talk to each other. They've got leaders like Nathan Law, who, of course, is the Hong Kong activist who's in exile in London. But they are developing ideas, and they're very consciously exchanging ideas between these different countries, between places like Hong Kong, Thailand, Taiwan. So the young people there and coming up with what they would like in the future. So there is some examples of demonstrations that were happening in the early 2020s, late sort of 1819, which might show the way for some of these Gen Z demonstrations in other countries now.
Sally Gimson, thanks for joining us. That was Sally Gimson, editor of Index on Censorship. Index on Censorship's next issue is a special look at the Gen Z protests. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Social media has been used to incite and organise protests before, perhaps most notably during the Arab Spring of the early 2010s. But at that time, the core participants in the Gen Z protests were still at school. They have since shaped a new online realm, and it has doubtless shaped them. I'm joined finally by James Ball, political editor at New World magazine and author most recently of The Other Pandemic, How QAnon Conquered the World. James, first of all, how significant does it strike you that this is that first generation of human beings who have known nothing but the connected world, people to whom social media is just another utility, like water coming out of the taps or the lights coming on at the flick of the switch?
I think we have to be a little bit cautious in that young people tend to be the ones who feel like they've got the raw end of the deal, who feel most able to mobilise, who are bravest. And so some of this might just be a little bit of it was ever thus. But there does feel to be something a bit Arab Spring-ish about the quality of these protests, in that so much of it, digital mobilisation has been essential to them. But what's interesting is, the novelty of the Arab Spring was almost, you'd think Facebook had coordinated the protests. It was almost like an advert for Mark Zuckerberg. Now it feels a little bit like we're talking about, isn't it amazing that these two people have arranged to meet up by text message? They are organising digitally. They're using all sorts of digital comms tactics. They're using social. But it's a bit like you said, the technology is invisible to them. But when you look at these disparate protests with disparate causes, the thing they have in common is the internet and is the tactics.
But do you see something different, if not necessarily in the way it's used to organise, than perhaps the language and the culture it now transmits? Because we're talking in 2025, comparing it to the Arab Spring of 14 years ago. And of course, in the way that social media platforms and communications technology and the internet have developed, 14 years is 3 or 4 generations in itself.
I think it's vastly easier now to mobilise and to mobilise in closed groups. You sort of had the problem 14 years ago in the Arab Spring that people had to try and coordinate in person or else only with people they knew. You could message your friends on Facebook or you could post openly on Twitter. And if you posted openly on Twitter, you reached the world potentially, but certainly reached other people who might then hear about the protest, but the authorities could see you immediately too. Now you can essentially have Discord groups or WhatsApp groups or Telegram groups that anyone can join with a QR code, and then you're in there and there might be 1,000 people all communicating on encrypted channels in ways that are quite hard for authorities to track down. And so the technology is a lot better for mobilizing these loose coalitions. They don't trust each other enough to, do something like the heist on the Louvre, but they can coordinate protest movements, they can test out messages on each other, they can test out memes on each other, and it lets you very quickly pull a movement together with a lot less of the infrastructure and the logistics and those expertise that you would have needed even in 2010 and far more in the past beyond that.
I mean, do we see then something of a generation gap in the response of the authorities to a lot of these protests? In Nepal, for example, they tried to shut off the internet or they tried to shut down various social media platforms. Does that demonstrate that when the authorities go into this kind of whack-a-mole mode that they just don't actually understand how this stuff works now?
You actually saw this in 2011 as well. Egypt kept trying to shut off the internet and then finding it had to turn it back on because it couldn't do things like operate its banking system without it. And the internet's got closer and closer to being critical infrastructure. And if a country wasn't prepared for riots or to crack down on free speech, you can't just do that overnight. And so that's actually helped these groups. I think also a lot of this being on dark social, which sounds very sinister, but is just social you can't see. We can see a message on Twitter, we can see a post on Instagram, we can't see a message to a WhatsApp group. So a lot of it being there means you can't just sort of shout at a social network, take all your public posts down. So I think they've still got a lot of ability to restrict messaging, to have information control. I think as big tech cooperates with more and more autocratic governments, we have seen China's ability to keep social control is aided by tech, it's not harmed by it. But if it catches you on the hop, it's quite hard to overnight turn things off, and it only gets more difficult. And I think when you look at the responses, I think it has often backfired on those. A lot of these protests have actually had quite a lot of success, even if they've also, they've had deaths, they've had casualties, they've had some quite brutal repression.
I mean, for all that, as you point out, we can't see all of the discourse in a way that we once could. If you think about what you have seen of it, or what you've been able to see of it, do you detect any evolution in those jokes and memes that you mentioned earlier? Are we learning anything new about the discourse of protest, or is this basically, as you were suggesting before, just this generation of angry young folk doing what angry young folk always do, but by slightly different means?
I think anytime you look at protest or anytime you look at memes, you get reminded that we're all a lot more similar than we think. People who grow up in very different cultures and very different languages communicate in quite similar sort of ways. Images are a lot more important than text. Video is more important than images. In the same way as these days a movement of under 25s would be mobilized by video, here, that is what's happened in a lot of these countries. Images and photos have gone round. You want people to hit forward. You want people to pass stuff around. So satire's in there, humorous messages are in there, anger is in there, and text is there. Text is still kind of essential, but it's not the star anymore. This is not about people writing glorious sort of poetry of revolution.
But that notwithstanding, is there, and again, acknowledging that protest is and has always been, to an extent, performative. That's the point of doing it. You are creating a public spectacle of dissent. But is that different now? Are people doing it not so much en masse for one news camera as gathering in a big mass and then doing it individually into their own phones?
Yes, I think the protest and the messaging themselves is the point a lot more. It isn't a tactic you do to attract mainstream media anymore. It's almost a tactic you do to get more people to protest, to get more people at it. Where at the very minimum having to share the stage, we might actually starting to get shoved off stage. We used to be the mechanism for these protests. It used to be you get things online, you make the protest happen, it gets reported in the world media, the government takes notice. That often changes the calculus of a government as to whether it has to crack down or whether it has to make concessions. But more and more, this is about communicating directly, communicating online, and the media, as we would think of it, doesn't really enter their thoughts. And that's quite sad for me. I'm not quite ready to be irrelevant yet. I haven't even turned 40, I've got a few months left.
That was James Ball, political editor at New World magazine and author of The Other Pandemic, How QAnon Conquered the World. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.